I'm Sarah Beck with Pacific Horticulture. I'm here at Filoli in Woodside, California, where staff are helping us to share questions from our gardening and allied professional audience on what they want to know about managing drought in the garden. Our expert panelists include climate-ready landscape plants researchers, extension specialists, nursery, and other horticulture field professionals.
What is the best mulch?
It's fresh wood chips straight out of the chipper. And I know in Southern California, Dr. Jim Downer talks about this all the time. You start composting wood chips before you spread them, and you're losing everything that's composted. That should be returning to the soil, and it's not. So fresh wood chips straight out the box. It's got a nice mix of actual cellulose, of wood material, of bark, of green tissue that gives you that little bit of nitrogen. There's this huge myth out there that wood chip mulch actually locks up nitrogen rather than supplying it. And that's been put in the shade by so many different researchers. But even if so, a little bit of green material in there gives the microbes all the nitrogen they need to keep the system flowing. But yeah, there isn't any better mulch, and that's based on our research and many others. Look to Jim Downers really in specific for California, that fresh wood chip mulch with green, with twigs, with bark, with wood is by far the best.
We have a big problem here down in San Diego with borers, tree borers. And when I was talking to the county entomologist, I think it was the county entomologist, their advice was that if you get fresh wood chips, make sure that they're smaller than 1 inch so that you don't risk bringing borers from trees that have died of borer infection onto your property.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. We have that protocol in place all over the country. When we're chipping ash trees with emerald ash borer, it has to be less than 1 inch. When we're down in Southern California chipping trees that may be or definitely are infested with the polyphagous shothole borers, the invasive shothole borers that you see down there, it's actually, I think, 3/4 of an inch that we try and specify. So some chippers, and again, it depends on the equipment. It kind of comes back to the same answer with some of the irrigation. Like there are some tree removal companies that use very big chippers that do not get it down to 1 inch. And then there's other companies that more play in the world of pruning that use much smaller chippers. And there's no question that those beetles will be eradicated. So that is an absolute valid concern. There's nothing I would question about that 1 inch number for the vast majority of potential borers.
If you look at fire studies on mulch, the partially composted mulch is more fire resistant, or rather harder to ignite than the fresher stuff. So that might be something where you go, you know what, I'm in a high severity fire zone. I'm going to go for the more composted stuff that's harder to ignite than the stuff that's totally fresh. But also I would say this mulch conversation is not mulch in the place of leaving your leaves and just letting, if you have leaf litter, that's fine. This isn't, we should be scraping that stuff up to make everything clean and then put down the mulch that we want.
I think that's a really good point. And the fresh mulch is a little bit more ignitable. But when you look at the factor that is flame height and like open combustibility, they're not that much different.
I'm hearing from a number of people here down in San Diego area that they are losing their homeowners insurance because the insurance companies are saying that they're withdrawing their insurance coverage because of mulch.
I would love to sit down with those insurance companies to explain that the ease of ignition for any garden is benefited by healthy plants as opposed to drought stressed ones. And the mulch is the easiest, best, and most environmentally sound way of keeping our plants well hydrated and happy, or rather appropriately hydrated for their type and happy. And that we've got to stop looking at mulch as though the mulch existing or not existing is going to save a structure, when that structure, if it was hardened and if it doesn't ignite, if the structure doesn't ignite, it doesn't burn. And we can't be blaming mulch for that failure.
When I lost my insurance, my insurance company wanted me to cut down a host of my trees in my garden. And I simply wouldn't do it, of course. But one of my questions to them is, are all of us being asked to do as far as planting trees and create carbon capture, and yet here in California, to keep your insurance, you have to cut all the trees away from your property to have a swath of 100 feet of bare ground. So just that. But back to the weeds, I think another thing that when talking about mulch with customers, I often also will talk to them about depth of mulch. Because I think a lot of people, you say mulch, and I think their tendency is to go to the store and buy as few bags of mulch, if that's what they're going to do, as possible. And, obviously, if you're getting, chipper chips dumped, which is also what I do, I don't let any organic matter actually leave my property, my garden. But, I think it's important to talk about mulch, both for weeds and for depth for weed control, as well as the benefits of the organic improvements that can be made and using less water.
What about bark chips versus wood chips?
It depends on the bark species, because a lot of these conifers, the bark that a lot of these sort of bark nugget products come from are really quite waxy. And if you're not careful about these, and if you pile them too deep, or if you let them go a year or two without stirring them up, they create an umbrella. They create a very hydrophobic layer. And so pure bark, I despise that one. It's not as low on my list as, shredded tires or shredded, like those dyed shredded pallet products. But the pure bark, and even that, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the gorilla hair mulch. It's actually shredded, stringy redwood bark. That stuff, first of all, is extremely flammable, but also creates a pretty hydrophobic mat pretty quickly if you're not careful. So I would stay away from the pure bark, just because bark has a lot of stuff in it that, it's got waxes in there, and it's just not going to be friendly for water penetration for very long if that's all that's there.
How do you determine the use of mulch when also wanting to provide bare ground for bees or allow seed propagation?
I don't know that there's a rule of thumb. I mean, I come back to everyone on this panel has said this so far today in one way or another. The answer to every single question in all of biology is it depends. And, which species are you trying to maximize habitat for? I don't want necessarily bare ground nesting bees in my landscape. And I know that in my suburban town, there's plenty of bare ground. I don't need to provide that. The next lot over has it, so I'm not going to do that. Then again, I have a lot more mulch at my house than anyone else in my neighborhood, but no, so I don't think you could say there's a rule of thumb. I think that a diverse landscape that includes a diversity of species and layers, different heights and different seasonality of when there's foliage, when there's flowers, the just every single factor you could put in a list of how to diversify a landscape is going to be beneficial for beneficials. And so, whatever you can do. And I've told clients a million times that throw a handful of wildflower seeds down in a little corner of your garden, and that's going to do more than anything, that anybody else is doing.
Do you recommend landscape fabric or other weed control options?
Not for homeowners, no.
Not for homeowners.
I'm spraying at my house right now because I've got a rather large landscape that wasn't really cared for many years, and the weed pressure is massive. So I think using those other methods that you guys talked about, cardboard or even plastic to solarize or landscape fabric, thinking of it like you're going to go put it in with your staples for a period of time to help get the weeds under control in that area, and then manage it in some other way. I just, I've never heard anybody who's really happy that they put that landscape fabric in, it's never a good idea, I think.
The home we bought, they did it because it looked perfect, and then they had also mulched it. And so the some of the maples in our landscape, their roots grew up and over it. So then when we were removing out the plastic, which was exceedingly hard to do, right? Landscape staples stay in really long. We were also really damaging root structures. Yeah, we use it because we don't put anything over it. So it's on our fields or our gravel. Yeah, but you see it. So it's, yeah, no.
I used to say to my students, mulch does a lot of wonders. And now we understand why they do that more and more. There is a layer of mulch and a layer of soil. And because of that, it does a lot of protection in terms of temperature, buffering, as well as keeping the water loss from the soil to the atmosphere. It's kind of another layer, right? It's just bigger particles. And so it does lose a lot less water than in bare soil. So keeping the soil moisture while protecting that from weed and temperature control.
How do I know whether to cut down a mature urban tree?
I see one conversation frequently with people that advocate for native plants, so cutting down your existing non-native trees and planting native trees. And then we'll have a loss of net canopy for decades. And we need to do a replacement strategy if you want to go native. Then there might not be a native tree appropriate for your lot because of your climate or your size. So maybe the non-native tree is still the best. But there was one question about cutting down a 50-year-old tree. Unless it's damaged or dangerous, no, you can't, we need to think long-term and planning for the future and doing a replacement strategy, keep what we have alive, plant new things, plant seeds. That's a lot less disturbance. Plant acorns, not big box trees. But yeah, I don't advocate for cutting down trees unless they're dangerous.
I would kind of liken that to if you had an older house. So if you had an older house that was built like a 1920s California bungalow, or maybe some sort of, Italianate type of townhouse that was built in the late 1880s, that's not going to be as energy efficient as a brand new house. But no one would argue demolishing that and replacing it with something sort of new. The best thing that you can do is try and make decisions and retrofits to sort of make your house more energy efficient. And kind of like with the tree that is maybe not climate appropriate, it's still functional, it's still providing shade, it's providing really good aesthetic value. And in that case, what you should do is try and irrigate responsibly, apply enough water to allow the tree to kind of maintain its function and enjoy it.
If it's gotten to a size where it is beginning to interfere with infrastructure. So if it's lifting the, foundation of a home, or if it's there, you can no longer pave the driveway because the roots have completely lifted it. And in those cases, you want to make those decisions very circumspectly. You want to know, and I would try to plan for something in the meantime, like, what am I going to do to replace this? Let's not just take a black earth approach and just go in, take everything out because we know they're high water users. So I think a measured approach needs to be taken, a thoughtful approach.
How should we help trees get through the hot and dry summer months?
I've worked with CAL FIRE for close to 10 years. They have a very large urban forestry program, which most people aren't aware of, about saving trees during the last 2 drought periods we've had. And there's definitely 2 different ways. If we talk the deep and infrequent, but you're not going to do that with a small tree that will die. So we need to make sure people understand the new trees really need a lot of water to get going. And once they're established, then you gradually change their watering regime to whatever's appropriate for that type. So that's a conversation.
I think anytime you're talking low water, you have to be talking to customers in those terms of, yes, they're low water or low water users, but only after establishment. An establishment period for a smaller, more perennial, herbaceous perennial type plant is going to be much shorter than, a shrub or especially a tree.
Yeah, even the same species of tree coming out of a 3 or 5 gallon can versus a 96-inch box. 96-inch box, that's going to be 5 to 10 years that it's truly established, whereas that 5 gallon bucket is going to be established maybe in a year or 2.
This is a question that I've asked the arborists that are around here, because what confuses me, and I've been doing this for a million years, is when you have a drought year or many drought years, and you have established trees, how do you decide that, I've never watered in the summer before, but now we're in the midst of a large drought. How do I start watering those trees? How do I know to start watering those trees? What am I going to do so I'm not stressing the trees by overwatering them in summer?
I think if it's never been watered and it's a Southern California tree, you still don't water them in summer. And what I would suggest is, let's say you're talking about a 150-year-old live oak. We'll look at the historic rain period for that 150 years. And if the rain typically starts in that period in late September or early October, and this year it doesn't look like it's going to start raining, then start watering. It's not about watering in summer. It's about recreating the environment that tree grew in for its first 130 of its 150 years. So I always tell people, start the winter on time, even if winter doesn't start on time. And if winter ends early, extend the winter to historically average when the rain stops. So where I live, the rain usually stops in April. For many years, it was stopping in February. So I would water my trees that were native until April and then stop for the summer. Dead stop, hard sentence, so my advice on those Mediterranean, even if it's not California native, Mediterranean native, whatever, is whatever they're adapted to over the course of their life and their exact, location is recreate that. And not fake it with summer rain, because there is no summer rain usually. It's extend the winter to what it used to be.
We've lost millions of trees in California last drought periods, both in urban and that wild setting, and it's because of the dry winters. They have to have, and oak trees, they need that winter wetness to store in their tissues, and those dry winters are really hard.
One of the things all of the academics in the state that I know, as well as DWR, have agreed upon is that we should be preserving trees even during drought because of the high degree of heat mitigation that they provide in city areas, and not preserve, a tree is a long-term horticultural asset in a landscape. And I know of no one that's involved in this field who would say, let your trees go completely, unless they are, native oaks that are in an area where they would not be getting water anyway, or some other native tree that would not be watered at all during the summer. So we typically recommend, if you're not say you've let the lawn go under a tree, that once a month you go in and do a nice deep soak on your trees. So if they're on another irrigation system that's getting very low water, and that tree might be a moderate water tree, then just lay a soaker hose, or lay a hose that's running slowly underneath those trees and give them a good soak about once a month. Most mature trees in a landscape will do fine with that, because they're getting some water. Their roots have gone out underneath the infrastructure, under the sidewalks, under the streets, and they're getting some runoff water. and some leaky sewer water, and they're getting some other little bits of water here and there. That was a lesson that we learned from Australia during their 9-year drought, was that the trees that survived were surviving by taking water from leaky urban infrastructure. But they can still use a little extra juice about once a month during really hot spells.
Yeah,
Just during the really hot spells.
Yeah, you have to be careful with trees that in their native environment, if they don't normally get summer water, that's one thing. But those same trees in an urban landscape where they've been used to getting water, you can't just shut them off. Like Carrie said, you have to give those kinds of trees extra water.
And they're worth it.
And they're worth it.
Right,
Those trees are irreplaceable.
We've been having this discussion quite a bit about this. There's a term popularized now, summer dry, summer dry landscapes. And to me, it smacks of the word xeriscape, which was very unpopular because of the way it sounds, right? The onomatopoeia effect of something sounding unpleasant. And yes, our natural landscapes are very dry in the summer, but urban conditions are very different. And they will be unlivable if we don't invest some water in our urban landscapes in order to mitigate that urban heat island effect. And I think it's a good use of urban water. Not that we waste it, but that we optimize it in order to mitigate the effect because of all of the effects that having green spaces, the positive effects of having green spaces in urbanized areas.
So here at Filoli, our approach during drought years has been to reduce down foundation beds, woody plantings, wherever we can, to around 40% below their normal summer irrigation frequency. And then there have been times also where we've taken lawns completely offline, so turned lawns into mulched areas to conserve water. But our vision for the future is to take some lawns completely offline and turn them into stone or DG terraces so that we're not irrigating them. And then there are major plantings around the garden where we're moving to lower water plants. Some of them are historic even, but others as a way of adapting more of the garden to low water is our plan.
Can enough trees be planted to save our planet?
There's a ton of data out there available on these mass tree planting projects, and the soil represents a massive carbon sink. There is a lot of carbon dioxide that's not in the atmosphere because it's locked up in the soil. And every time you disturb that soil, every time you dig a hole, let alone 10,000 holes, because we're going to plant 10,000 trees that 6 of them will be alive next year, you're releasing a tremendous amount of carbon. And even if every one of those trees survive, which I assure you they won't, they're not going to recapture even the carbon that escaped that soil for another 50 years if they get there, let alone start becoming a net sink. So, planting trees is definitely good. I also, if you look at some of the tools online like iTree, there's a tool called MyTree that you can calculate the benefits of a single individual tree. And when you look at the size of a tree, the species of tree, the growth rate, none of that matters as much as where you planted it. So in California, if you plant it on the southwest side of your house, you're doing much more for the environment in avoidance of emissions, because of the air conditioner that you're not having to use as much is way more important than the amount of carbon that tree's actually capturing.